meaning do the rules of the language associate with such an expression? It's something, I mean, no one knows really. It's still very much an open issue. But many scholars, among those who study lexical semantics and polysemy, believe that the meaning of a polysemy of such an expression. So to give you an example, I've got the verb to get in English, which is very, very frequent and very polysemous. So many scholars believe that the meaning of such an expression is schematic. It's sort of an abstract schema, can be applied in many ways, and the schema has to be fleshed out on any particular use. And that accounts for the fact that there are very different uses, which gives us very different truth conditions. So here I've got this example from Michael Peltzar. Smith has got the virus, which can be used either to mean that he's contracted the virus, or perhaps if he's a scientist doing research on a certain virus, he went to a certain country to collect a sample of it. And if I say, he got the virus finally, that means that he's actually collecting a sample of it. And the truth conditions, the content, or the proposition expressed is different. And the question is, how do we account for that fact? So one theory says the meaning of a polysemous expression like get is very abstract. In different contexts, it will be fleshed out differently. There is another theory, though, which says that just the expression is ambiguous. There are different possible readings. It's just ambiguity like other ambiguous expressions. Now, many people don't like this, and for good reasons, I believe, because it's not obvious that there is a discrete list of senses available in advance, as it were. Or rather, it seems that there is a continuum of possible senses to which one can creatively add in an open-ended manner. So that's the justification for the schematic view. But I think that something in between must be right, because it's pretty clearly the case that there are also senses that we store in memory for those words, like get the virus. It's something like a collocation. We have a particular sense that we assign to that, and that's stored in our file for get, maybe, I suppose. So to say that there is an abstract schema because of this open-ended continuity and so on is not to say that the meaning of the expression reduces to such a schema. I think that the expression is also associated in memory with conventional ways of using it in collocations with more or less determinate senses. And I think that all that I've mentioned, the abstract schema or perhaps schemata, there may be several, the collocations, the senses, all that goes into the linguistic meaning of the expression. And if that's right, that means that the linguistic meaning of the expression is something rather messy. It's a big file of stuff. And that's not at all the sort of thing that could be contributed to what is said. It's not a sense at all. It's something very different from a sense. So on this view, the meaning of such an expression doesn't have the right format to be what the expression contributes to what we say when we speak. So the meaning, the thing that's associated with the expression in virtue of the rules of the language, the thing we know simply in virtue of knowing the language, is very different from the particular sense or concepts that will be expressed on a particular occasion. Those are different things. So the conclusion as far as those items is concerned is that the sense of such an expression like get is determined on the basis of its conventional meaning plus other things. The conventional meaning is not a sense already. The sense has to be constructed on the basis of the conventional meaning. And among the other things that may play a role, it's pretty clear that the context is one such thing. And they include into the context the topic of conversation, what one is talking about, which is quite an important feature. And the new one here are issues about which there is a certain degree of consensus among researchers, both in philosophy and in linguistics. And that's the reason why I think that a moderate form of contextualism is now quite clearly dominant in the field. So the other issue is the extent of context sensitivity issue. The question is how widespread is context sensitivity? Is it pervasive in natural language? Now, it's accepted on all sides that there is a basic set of expression whose content is known to depend upon the context in a systematic manner, said in lexicals, and so basically there is a list of context-sensitive expressions that you find in textbooks about pragmatics, so they give you a list of context-sensitive expressions like I or third-person pronoun and all these expressions or constructions. But for a long time, there's been a certain presumption at work, at least in the philosophy of language, and to some extent also in linguistics. I call it the literalist presumption. And that's a presumption that expressions that are not in that list, so expressions that are not known as indexical, that are not the tenses, so we've got this list of expressions known to be context sensitive, and there are expressions that are not known to be context sensitive. For example, the expression watch. Watch is not known to be context sensitive. And the presumption is that expressions that are not in the basic set are by default assumed to be context insensitive. And actually, this presumption played a quite important role in theorizing about all sorts of semantic phenomena. Because of that presumption, the possibility that an expression might be context-sensitive, even though it's not known to be context-sensitive, was simply disregarded. And other explanations for a particular semantic phenomenon were tried first. And the only case in which you would appeal to context sensitivity was if really it's not possible to do anything else. So there was a sort of priority. Theories not in terms of context sensitivity were privileged, as opposed to theories appealing to context sensitivity, which were sort of discarded. And that, so in many areas, I don't have time actually to give examples of the damage caused by this presumption. Anyway, there was this presumption. But now, not many people accept this. There are only the minimalists who were talked about previously in the talk. I mean, some people like Capellan and Lepore, maybe they still believe that. But in general, people have given up the literalist presumption. And now the view that people accept is what I call methodological contextualism. That's the idea that we don't know in advance which expressions are context sensitive and which aren't. As far as we know, for all we know, every expression might be context sensitive. So we must look, actually. It's an empirical matter whether a given expression like watch is context sensitive or not. Okay, now that's the, so when there is a semantic phenomenon, among the possibilities for accounting for the phenomenon, there is the possibility of arguing that the expression is context sensitive and the context plays some role in accounting for intuitions. Okay, now, moderate contextualism. The two contextualist ingredients I've described so far are basically the view that pragmatic competence is involved in fixing content, in fixing what is said, because we've got those context-sensitive expressions that depend upon what the speaker means. They have a reference depend upon what the speaker means, on the one hand, and the idea that context sensitivity is actually pervasive. For all we know, every expression might be context sensitive. Every day we discover new context sensitive expressions. These two ideas together are very widely shared. And together, they characterize moderate contextualism. So anyone who accepts these two views accepts a moderate form of contextualism. That is, the context actually plays a big role. And it's not just the context in the sense of the external aspects of the situation of utterance. It's a very rich context that involves, in particular, the attitudes of the speech participants and their background knowledge and all that. So those who still believe in either modularity or the literalist presumption are a small minority of provocative philosophers like the minimalists. But radical contextualism is another minority at the other end of the spectrum. And that's so I belong to that minority, so I've got to say something in favor of it. So first, what's the defining idea? I think the defining idea is that context sensitivity is not just pervasive, it generalizes. So it's universal, basically. Every utterance has got this property. So you take any utterance, its content depends upon the context. That's the idea. And there are several arguments to that effect, and I will actually discuss two such arguments. So the first argument I call the argument from lexical semantics, and the second argument is the argument from pragmatic modulation. So in order to present those arguments, I need to list a few assumptions that they are sort of controversial, but I will take them for granted for the sake of the discussion. It doesn't really matter. They sort of suggest using a certain framework. There might be other frameworks. It doesn't really matter. So those are the assumptions which I will take for granted. First, and those are assumptions that are also fairly widespread, at least among philosophers. First, there is the idea that utterances express propositions or thoughts or contents or have truth conditions. That's the first idea. And second idea, these propositions or thoughts expressed by utterances themselves, they are made out of, or they can be analyzed into certain building blocks or constituents, which we may call senses or contents. Now, I say can be analyzed into. That doesn't mean that they have to be analyzed into, but at least they can be analyzed into. So if you've got this notion of the content expressed, the proposition expressed by an utterance, that's its content, that's what you say when you make this utterance. And this proposition itself has a sort of constituent structure. It has constituents, and the constituents we will call senses. And they sort of correspond to the constituent of the sentence that expresses the proposition. Okay. Now, so those were the assumptions I want to take for granted. Now, there are other assumptions that are the disputed claims. I want to discuss them. And actually, I think that the contextualists a radical contextualist at least will be led to deny them. So first assumption, first disputed claim, the conventions of the language, the linguistic rules themselves, associate expressions with senses or contents. Now remember, by sense or content, I mean the building blocks of the proposition, the aspects of what is that thing that is communicated or that is expressed when you speak. And the idea is that the conventions of the language associate expressions of the language with certain senses or contents that they express, that corresponds to them, that they encode. So first claim. Second claim, what an expression contributes when it is used is the content it possesses in virtue of the conventions. So when you use an expression, that expression contributes something to the proposition expressed by your utterance, and what it contributes is the sense that it independently possesses in virtue of the rules of the language. That's the second assumption. And the third assumption is that indexicals are an exception. Their content is not to be equated with their linguistic meaning, what they possess in virtue of the rules of the language, because the content of indexicals depends upon the context. So here things are a bit more complex. The content is not directly given by the rules of the language. So those are the claims that are very common, but I want to dispute. So I said that there were two arguments, the argument from lexical semantics and the argument from pragmatic modulation. I start with the argument from lexical semantics, and that's an argument to the effect that the first assumption and the third assumption have to be rejected.